Hello, my name is Joe Wood, and my project today will be on eyewitness identification in child witnesses on the autism spectrum. Some background information on autism spectrum disorder, or ASD. It's a developmental disorder that causes impairments in social communication, social interaction, and repetitive behaviors. It affects around 1% of the population in the US, though that number has been rising in recent years. Some previous studies have looked into how people with ASD are likely to be overrepresented as eyewitnesses in criminal courts, sometimes perhaps due to their repetitive behaviors, making them frequent locations that potential crimes could be committed in. And these difficulties in recognizing facial features and potential memory impairments that people on the spectrum may have will somewhat impair their testimonies and perhaps make them inaccurate. This particular experiment was conducted by a team led by Rachel Wilcock from the University of Winchester. It was conducted in 2019, so the results are pretty recent, and it was featured in the Journal of the Research in Autism Spectrum Disorders. Its goal: to compare the accuracy of eyewitness testimonies from groups of typically developing children, or TD groups, and children with ASD based on eyewitness testimonies of a mock crime. Could ASD individuals, especially children, identify things and remember important details from a crime that happened, as well as individuals who are typically developing? So, where do I fit into this? Well, when I'm not making terrible fashion choices, I'm a sophomore at Canisius College. I'm a research assistant at the Institute of Autism Research, where I work with children who are both typically developing and children on the spectrum in a variety of experiments. Some of my previous ones looking into how idioms correlate with autism and how autistic children recognize emotions on a broader sense compared to typically developing individuals. Why I'm interested in this study is because next year I'll be planning a study with Dr. Goodsell that will also look into the potential differences in accuracy between typically developing and ASD kids, but with an added twist: suggestibility. For the participants, there were 50 kids in the ASD group, which was overwhelmingly male, and it ranged from 6 to about 12 years old. The age range was consistent in the typically developing group, though it was much larger, but it did have a more equal gender distribution. The IQ for both groups is above 69, which would, in ASD terms, be referred to as high functioning. And all of the kids were given a face memory task, which the typically developing kids scored significantly higher on, consistent towards other findings that say that children on the spectrum do not recognize facial expressions or emotions as easily as typically developing do. The procedure was that the kids watched a video with two male actors where one of them stole the other's key or phone. And they were asked about these events by one of the researchers directly afterwards or a week later. And in this trial a week later, they were asked to identify the offender in a lineup of pictures. It was very akin to a lot of the studies that Dr. Goodsell runs in his lab, and the actual assessment of the data came later, where the lineups featured either pictures of the actual offender and ones where they did not feature pictures of the actual offender. If you look at the results from both the autism video and typically developing video sections, you'll notice that they look remarkably similar, and the researchers were similarly surprised when they found that these results show that there is not a significant difference in the performance of both groups on this eyewitness test study, which is remarkable because it's a null hypothesis to the initial idea that typically developing individuals will perform much better on eyewitness testimonies due to their greater abilities in facial recognition than their ASD peers. So these findings, contrary to previous literature, suggest that group differences in facial recognition between ASD and TD kids may not be significant in real-world eyewitness testimonies, because the facial recognition task used primarily looked at still images of faces that faded after brief intervals, whereas this experiment tested ASD children and typically developing children with dynamic videos of somewhat actual crimes. However, the identification performance in both groups was low, which suggests that the researchers could perhaps do more to make the individuals perpetrating the crimes and the foils in this case for both actors to look perhaps somewhat more similar, so that they are either not too easy to be identified or too difficult to be identified. And some of the perpetrator one's data does suggest that it was more difficult for both groups to identify this individual. Why these results are important? Well, in England and Wales, there's a group called the Registered Intermediary, which helps to communicate between police officers and eyewitnesses, especially vulnerable witnesses, which include kids and people with ASD, to help them understand more about their role and how to most effectively give accurate information about eyewitness testimonies. And this group has been shown in some studies to bolster eyewitness identification performance in typically developing children through their adaptations. So this study, perhaps by showing that there's not too much of a difference between typically developing and ASD children in terms of facial recognition, could help to suggest that some of these programs could be implemented with ASD individuals as well. But every study is not perfect, and in this case I could come up with 3 specific problems that pertain to it. The first one being that both groups seem to have more difficulty identifying perpetrator 1 noticeably more than perpetrator 2, which suggests that the perpetrator and the lineup foils in the first situation may have been too similar to accurately portray what the eyewitness testimonies could have been. Also, the kids in the study all had IQs that were either above average or well above average, which would make the ASD children high functioning. And while this does pertain to a certain portion of the ASD population, there's another portion which is what we would consider low functioning, which would have lower IQs. And while these findings may extrapolate to the high functioning group, the low functioning may not be as receptive. And finally, these results are based on a study that involved a mild mock threat, such as stealing a phone or keys using 2 actors, which may not be an accurate portrayal of real crime, which could involve numerous people in very high-stakes situations that could especially be difficult for ASD children to emotionally focus on and grapple with, especially with all the different stimuli that they have to cope with. If I were to change the study, I would perhaps look at low-functioning children with ASD to include, although I know this is difficult to do, especially for the IAR, which primarily focuses on high-functioning autistic children. Also to find foils and perpetrators that look different enough without being too obvious, which is a difficulty faced by many eyewitness mock trials. And finally, having more than 2 actors, since crimes could potentially happen where there are far more distractors in the real world, which is not quite as sanitary as perhaps a quick clip that's done and shown in a lab, especially through a computer setting later on. So how can we build from the study? Well, this study shows that there might be a chance that, contrary to popular literature, that ASD children and typically developing children might not significantly differ in their eyewitness testimonies. And this will be important for the study that I'll be helping to create next year with Dr. Goodsell in our joint project with the IAR and his eyewitness testimony lab, in which we'll look into a situation slightly different, whereas this study took the typically developing and ASD groups and asked them questions involving eyewitness testimony in a relatively unbiased way. Next year, we'll look into how suggestibility may play a role in the validity of these testimonies and how it may differ for either the typically developing or the ASD group, since there are some indicators that the ASD group may be more vulnerable to suggestibility going forward. So it'll be interesting to see if these findings in this study replicate given the conditions that we're trying to test for.